Hi, welcome back. In this third module, we're going to tackle some very large questions: Christology, ecclesiology, and missiology. And I'll confess right at the beginning that we won't get them all fully covered. There's just too much to do. But hopefully we will get a sense of where the United Church stands on some of these big issues. Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" echoes down through the centuries. And the question confronts us and it demands an answer in the 21st century, even as it did in previous centuries. Historically, we, the Church, have always understood that Jesus the Christ stands at the center of the Christian tradition. Put it another way, because of the centrality of Jesus for the Christian, it is found in the claim that one is Christian because one sees God most fully revealed in Jesus as the Christ. However, many contemporary Christians, including some you will encounter in your congregations, are unsure in what way, or even if, they can adhere to such an understanding. And here are three of the challenging factors. Number one, there is the matter of interfaith relationships or religious pluralism, and those raise questions. Can we, or how can we, square the claim that we see God most clearly revealed in Jesus with a positive valuing of other traditions? Some Christians are fine viewing Jesus as the only way to God and have no difficulty claiming that the practice of other faiths is wrong, or even a certain route to eternal damnation. However, an increasing number of Western Christians judge that other religious traditions, or at least some of them, are at least potentially valid routes to the divine. Some would go further. But if one sees Islam or Hinduism or Judaism or some other religion as a valid path to God, how do we sustain the claim that Jesus is the most full revelation of the divine? And that's tough. Let's be honest. It's tough because, it's tough in part because we have hundreds of years of history that equated honoring Jesus with dishonoring other faiths. The historic claims of Jesus and the Christ and the struggle about those make attractive a form of universalist Unitarian position that believes in God but sees Jesus as, for example, a great teacher or a model human being. Certainly something less than God in human flesh. Now, Universalist Unitarians are quite clear for a number of reasons, including their understanding and place of Jesus, that they are not Christians. Some Universalist Unitarians in Canada would define themselves as Christian Unitarians, precisely because they want to accord Jesus a higher place than he traditionally receives in their path. So that's problem one, the question of interfaith, interreligious relationships. Question number two has to do with the effects of the Jesus Seminar. For those of you not familiar with this term, it was a group formed around Robert Funk, a group of biblical scholars who met in the 1980s and the 1990s, and their goal was to determine which of the New Testament statements attributed to Jesus were authentic and which were creations of the early church. From the Jesus Seminar come a vast production of very useful works on first century Palestine and the earliest church. Because of their commitment to knowing what Jesus really said, they have also helped us to learn a great deal about that period of time. Their effort to determine what Jesus really said has led a lot of Christians to put emphasis on the historical Jesus and try and separate him from the Christ. And so some people focus on the real man Jesus or the human Jesus. This position, which challenges the image of Jesus as a revelation of God, brings with it its own problems. Foremost among these is the nature of the Gospels. They were all written after the fact. By that I mean they all arise post-resurrection. And whatever they might record, they cannot avoid a conviction about the resurrected one. Put it more bluntly, no resurrection, no reason to write the Gospels. A faith based on a historical person, Jesus, is problematically then grounded upon someone for whom we have very few non-biblical references. The biblical sources are not biography or history as we would understand them. The first great scholar to search for the historical Jesus was Albert Schweitzer, and there is no question that his was brilliant work and it laid a foundation for the Jesus Seminar. And Schweitzer led the realization that each gospel writer's situation, purpose, context, and audience influenced what was written. He noted that the same is true about scholars. His image was of a scholar looking down a well to find Jesus and seeing their own face reflected back. So, what are we actually working with in an effort to construct a historical Jesus? If history is any indication, we may well construct a Jesus that reflects our time rather than his own, and our needs and our agenda rather than his. So there's interreligious dialogue, interfaith relationships. There's the Jesus Seminar. And factor number 3 has to do with wrestling with the historic claim of the two natures of Jesus, especially the divine nature. Incarnation insists that in this particular figure, God took human flesh and joined us. And from the very beginning, Christians have struggled to hold that together. We often seem to emphasize one nature at the expense of the other. At one point, we concentrate so much on Jesus' divinity that we lose sight of any human being. Then the pendulum swings and we end up with almost an entirely human Jesus. Neither satisfies the historic Christian claim. We are coming out of a period in the late 20th century where the humanity of Jesus was particularly emphasized. You can see it in hymns and books written in the late 20th century. You can see it in productions like Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell, or movies like Monty Python's Life of Brian, or Jesus of Montreal, or The Last Temptation of Christ. Overemphasizing Jesus' humanity leads us to neglect some important aspects of the incarnation. God took human flesh and lived among us. God is active to work for our salvation, and in surprising ways, we are not alone. Divine love and divine grace coming to us lies at the heart of the incarnation, but they come to us in a human form. We have grace, not because of what we have done and not because of who we are, but simply as grace. And grace is challenging for Western Christianity, dwelling as we do in an individualistic, accomplishment-obsessed culture. If it's all up to us, we generally end up with inordinate pride or deep despair. Jesus the Christ, both human and divine, representing the initiative of God, helps us to overcome such feelings. And thus it is that a faith statement about who Jesus the Christ is for Christians stands at the very center of the Christian tradition. That confession of faith defines us, and it's not the other doctrines, not activity in the world, not the stance of a denomination or a combination of denominations, important as those may be. But if we probe that, we find that many Christians, particularly in the Western world today, are unsure of how or whether they can continue to subscribe to the historic Christian confession that understands Jesus as the one in whom God is most fully revealed. That's not a matter of desire. It's a matter of genuine uncertainty about the possibility. Or if you do hold such a view, how would you do so, especially in light of multiculturalism and religious pluralism? Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and others are our neighbors. Our children play together. We are all found at the local food bank, either as volunteers or as clients. Your parishioners wonder, how can we hold a view which seems to declare that every other faith is objectively inferior to Christianity? And that uncertainty often leads to silence or really weak expressions of Christology. And that leaves the field apparently wide open for those who claim for Christianity an exclusive pathway to a right relationship with God. And that is buttressed by particular understanding of certain key passages. For example, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And we are all too aware of the history of potential results from such a position. It is entirely possible to move from the position that Jesus Christ is God's fullest revelation to the position that Jesus is God's only saving revelation. And the need to convert others follows as a natural outgrowth. Then we get into conversion by force if necessary. After all, isn't it the loving thing to do to save someone practicing a false faith from eternal punishment? Isn't it? And if those presumptions hold, then we have a compelling argument. But there are other possibilities for a robust Christology. Can't cover all of Christology in a single lecture, nor in a single sermon. So if you are going to tackle Christology in worship, and I encourage you to do so, I advise a series of sermons, perhaps each one focused on a different challenge faced by contemporary believers. To my mind and in my experience, the greatest challenge faced by parishioners is the interfaith or multi-faith one. The gospel lessons in the Easter season prior to Pentecost often contain sayings of Jesus, but that's just one possible place to do this kind of work. Many of your congregants may well be familiar with the passage from John that I just quoted a few minutes ago. They might be aware of the number of times it has been used to prove the claim that Jesus is the only way to God. They may likely have heard it as one of several readings at a funeral. Personally, I do not usually focus on a single verse in my preaching, but the use of this one and its familiarity might encourage me to do so. So what would we do with a passage like that as we attempt to formulate a robust Christology? Well, first of all, you need to set it in context, reading more than one verse. How does the preceding and following material help us to understand? I would read at least John 14, 1-6, and maybe even 1-14. I'd want to name the key problem, either for my listeners or for people that they know. What does it mean to claim that Jesus is the only way to God? If we understand that literally, what does it mean for my Jewish or Hindu neighbor? What does it mean for those who lived before Jesus or who have never heard of him? One way of understanding the passage is to say that absent a relationship with Jesus, you cannot have a saving, redemptive relationship with God. Many Christians still hold such a view. Yet many of your listeners will likely have deep questions about such a view if they don't reject it utterly. Does that mean they must also reject the notion of Jesus as the Christ, they might ask? In fact, in the past 25 years, the United Church of Canada has developed a number of statements stressing our need to be more fully understanding of the value of different traditions, to move beyond propaganda and name-calling. And so the setting for this particular passage, John 14, is in a long portion running from chapters 13 through 17, often called the Farewell Discourse. It is said in the context of Jesus' final evening with his followers. Most New Testament scholars would assert that it is a compilation of many statements of Jesus drawn together by the author or authors of the gospel. However, that does not change the reality that the passage portrays Jesus speaking at length to his most intimate followers. Whether taken literally or as a compilation, it's an intimate discourse. This is for those who are closest to Jesus. It demonstrates deep love and concern. It reflects mutuality in love and concern. And so I would suggest that the language of John 14:6 is the language of love. It is in the midst of an intimate message. When we speak the language of love, we speak truth. And although the things we declare may not be true for everyone, let alone scientifically verifiable, they are true for us and for the person to whom we speak. Think of the personal examples of the language of love: parent, child, partner, community. No one in their right minds would judge those statements as they would judge universally. But that does not take away their truth from me. For those of us who are followers of Jesus, then, this is a profoundly true statement. Jesus the Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way through which I have seen God most truly revealed. Through him, we see God as a loving parent, as opposed to some sort of other, often frightening manifestations given to the divine. We do not need to apologize for the language of love, nor do we have to give it up. We cannot, and we need not, state that others who follow a different path are somehow outside God's care and concern. How can we know? John 14:6 is an internal talk for a community in love with Jesus. If it's not universally true, that doesn't make it less true for us. To understand the verse as a language of love and to claim its absolute truth for those who share the circle of love does not say anything about anyone else. Such a reading is also more congruent with Romans 9-11 than the exclusivist interpretations often foisted on Paul. After long wrestling, Paul concludes that at the end of the day, God will be faithful to promises made long ago, because God is faithful. You see, I would actually absolutely reject any claim that I am undermining the claim of Jesus Christ for the Christian by arguing this way. Jesus is our path to God. Jesus is our way, our truth, and our life. We can enter into dialogue with other faiths as community or as individuals. In fact, I would want to go farther and claim that such an interpretation reasserts the freedom and sovereignty of God. Who am I to claim what God can and cannot do with people? I can surely speak of God's truth for my life and for my community. If I draw others to the same love of God through Jesus, by the quality of our life, well and good. In fact, in my extensive experience in interfaith dialogue, I have encountered many people who wish to have a strong representation of Jesus and the life he inspires. They have no interest in some mushy, one-size-fits-all Savior. They want us to be secure in Jesus the Christ and confident in our following of him. That is what allows for genuine, respectful dialogue. The doctrine of the church, ecclesiology, from the Greek word ecclesia, employed by the first Christians for their gathering, grows out of our belief in Jesus. It grows out of our belief in Jesus because we believe that Jesus, as the Christ, calls us, as the church, into being.